4, 3.
We'll do it live!
Now we're live! Aaron Kennedy. The general craziness of it, the impact on your life.
We have gone through so many stories and we said, you know what? Hey, guys. And hello to everybody watching. We are doing a kind of quickly assembled Friday episode in response to this tragic news out of Orlando, which happened on Wednesday when a reporter for Spectrum 13, Dylan Lyons, was killed by a gunman. We've all been receiving texts and messages from friends in and outside of the industry, wondering if we're going to address it. And, we talked about it because I mentioned, I feel like, I don't know, it hurts to talk about it, but we're going to try and shed some light on how it could have happened and how the industry has changed and becoming more dangerous for reporters.
Mm-hmm. And what his coworkers and other people in the business are thinking now when they're having to cover that. And then later, subsequently, when they're going out on stories where they're covering something similar. And now you've got real fear going on inside because okay, it can happen.
Mm-hmm.
That's the scary part.
Marissa, what were you hearing from your friends? Because you mentioned that you were receiving a lot of texts.
Yeah, so I actually reached out to people because I knew, well, let me back up a little bit. So I was live in the field on the morning show the morning that Allison Parker and Adam Ward from Roanoke, Virginia were shot and killed on live TV. And I remember the panic of the newsroom calling and saying, oh my gosh, get all the crews back immediately. Because, of course, you're concerned about copycats and what's going to happen. And when I heard about the reporter being shot in Orlando, it took me back to that feeling immediately. And so then, of course, I'm thinking of all my friends who are in the field still and who do this every day. And so I reached out to a couple people. And when I tell you the raw emotion, I mean, the thing I kept hearing over and over again was, this just hits way too close to home. This just hits way too close to home. And it's, I think, Aaron, when you and I were texting, I think that some people hear this and they think, my gosh, how could somebody shoot and kill a reporter, or they're part of the news? The news is always near crime scenes. How does something like this happen? And the fact of the matter is that news crews are first responders, just like police officers and other people. And so they, instead of running away from the tragedy, they're running towards it. And so I feel like news crews are very close and personal with crime scene investigations and hostage situations and manhunts and all these things. And so I think there's a lot to unpack here. I think it's important. Maybe it's just a good idea to sort of start with like, how could a reporter and a photographer be in this situation, right? And Aaron, you and Megan, with the weather coverage, you guys you've been in the field. You know how it is. We're kind of, as news crews, you're sitting ducks in a way.
Well, you are, and there is this kind of like thought in your mind that because you're part of the media, you're protected in some way, or that you're like a witness to history, that you're not going to be involved in said history that you're covering. And there isn't really that guarantee, especially in the day and age that we're living in now, where there's a lot of animosity towards the media. That's one of the problems. The other problem is there's just a lot of weird stuff going on, and it doesn't feel like it used to feel. And I think, other changes that have happened, and maybe you guys have seen this too, but like, I know when I first started working out on scene kind of stuff, there were always two people running the live truck, one to watch out for safety and the other to be doing the camera work and things like that. But as we've moved along and technology's gotten better and budgets have gone down, usually it's like a reporter and a photog if you're lucky. Not that would have stopped this, but that makes you feel a little less secure.
Right. Megan, I think you hit on, if you had to come up with two reasons why this happened, that's what it would have been. Number one, there are fewer people who now go out on stories, so there are fewer eyes watching.
Yep.
And Dylan was also an MMJ, which is a multimedia journalist. He had a photographer at this moment, but there are and have been many MMJs who are alone in the field when something happens to them. That being said, his photographer was also shot and is in critical condition because, as we know, when you're in the field with a photog, they have one eye in the camera on you. So they have one eye that's going to be able to observe the periphery. So with fewer eyes watching, it's going to be a more dangerous situation. Yeah. But then also, Of course, there is a steady drumbeat of animosity toward the media. That being said, I truly believe that it's more focused towards national media versus local. And I think we can underscore the likelihood, of course, that this gunman is just not well, right?
Yeah, but think about how many emails we got, guys, when we were working at local with people who thought that like Gail King was sitting next to us in the studio, or why don't you tell, fill in the blank that he needs to change his tie? And you're like, wait, they don't understand that they're in New York and we're here. So I agree with that. I think most people who understand think more about the national media, like that they're pulling the strings. But I think some of these people do not understand the difference between who's sitting next to who. It's just media is all lumped into one big pile that they don't like. Many
And I think at the end of the day, I think people forget that like people that you see on television are human beings. We're people, we have feelings, we're all the things. One thing I did want to talk about is, and I think we should dig into this a little bit if you're okay with it. I think we need to talk about the situation leading up to what happened. And of course, as a reporter, you get sent out into the fields, you get assigned a story. I don't even know the specifics about what the story was that they were covering in this case, but this is, from my experience, what I'm assuming happened, which is that there was some sort of crime scene investigation taking place. Dylan Lyons was assigned to that story, went out there with his camera, did his reporting, wrote his story. There's sweet young Dylan at 24 years old right there.
Look at that. You guys, I mean, Marissa, not to like interrupt, but like, look at that face. He just was so excited probably to be working in this market, to have this job, to have the opportunity to make a name for himself. And then all this is going on.
Yeah, it's just, it's truly heartbreaking when you think of it. You almost can't in a way, but obviously, your thoughts are with his family and his coworkers. And it's just, he went out there doing a job that he probably has done many times before. And I think for me, when I was in the situation, you get so comfortable on a scene. You've been there all day, right? You've walked up and down the street. You've talked to neighbors. You've gathered video. You may, in some cases, probably not in this one, but in some cases, you've been inside a home that maybe is connected to the story in some way. And so, I don't know if he was shot and killed doing a live shot, or if they were in the van just sitting and working.
I think they were in a van, and it was unmarked, and the scene had been cleared by police from the prior homicide. So,
okay, so
if you were, you would think it would be safe, right?
Right. But also let's talk about that a little bit. Like the scene had been cleared. Okay. So what that means is that there's no police left there. There's no police tape. There's no one official with official capacity left there on the scene. And so the reporter, as every newsroom does, gets the assignment to go out and put together a story all day and then go live in front of that location. And that's what he was doing. So chances are there was no one else around, or if there was, it was just the photographer. I can tell you from experience, I can't even guess how many times I've been sitting in the front seat of a live truck and someone walks up and knocks on the window. And of course you're like you don't want to come off as that person that doesn't want to roll down the window, but also they're a stranger and you're face to face. And I don't know if they have a gun. I don't know. I mean, who knows what could happen,
And no idea what their intentions are. There was a reporter from one of the other stations, to your point too, Marissa, who was on that scene earlier and got a really bad feeling and they left. So, but we have all been in the situation where leaving a scene of a story that you're assigned to do makes you question how it's going to be accepted by the news desk, by the management. Like, if I leave this scene, are they going to think I'm a wimp and I can't be here? Like, I feel uncomfortable, but I'm going to power through. We've all had that feeling and powered through, haven't we?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Marissa, I was trying to remember last night. I had trouble sleeping last night because I kept thinking about so many different scenarios. And were you part of that training that we had the one time in my professional career where I had safety training? Were you a part of that?
I think so. To be honest with you, I remember training when NATO was in town. That was when I first started back in 2013.
Yeah.
So I went through training back then just because it was so many people from, across the place. But I do think that, I do believe I was part of that training.
So,
Go ahead.
And I was even trying to remember what I learned from that. And I think that it is important that newsrooms and reporters are getting training on how to stay safe in the field. And you will hear messaging from management that says, if you don't feel safe, then you should leave. But, that might be a a little bit of CYA from them, right?
Probably,
It's another
yeah, a
thing to
little bit.
actually put it into practice.
Well, they don't want anybody to get hurt, but they want the story at the end of the day.
Right, right. And the only thing that I remember from that safety practice was, have a central spot with your photog to meet if something happens, find doorways to hide in, and what colors on police guns signify lethal force. Yellow versus red and stuff.
Oh,
that is all I remember.
But like, quite honestly, think about all the training that like military goes through, police go through, fire and rescue go through. Reporters, you got like one thing where you're trying to remember what it was. And granted, that was many years ago at this point, but like still, I never had training like that. You know what I mean? And we were all out on scenes. We do zero training to protect for that sort of thing happening. We just
I don't know. I mean, that training sounds fantastic. I think it's probably great when it's in a protest situation or in the NATO situation when I was covering. But I mean, for your run of the mill out front of a house or on a street or in front of a building, I don't know. I mean, as news crews, we're sitting ducks. And I know that
what was your training then for NATO?
Well, NATO was different because we were trained on, having to be like if you're in a big crowded situation to always push to the perimeter so you don't get trampled and all that. And so it was a lot of like what to dress, things to say to law enforcement so they know you're not a protester versus, I mean, it was totally different. But one thing I will say though is that, and I haven't talked to anybody locally or even in the news business as to what has happened as a result of this within the newsroom, but I hope and pray for the sake of the mental health of the journalists and the safety of the journalists that we're covering, that were out in the field when this story broke. I hope that everybody came back to the station. And if for no other reason, just to say, okay, this is a lot. We're going to take a beat. Everybody's going to report from the station today so that we're safe. Yeah. And then we're going to talk about, hopefully there's counselors that were brought in or safety professionals or somebody had a conversation about how do we proceed from here? Because listen, at the end of the day, and this is what the story was when Allison Parker and Adam Ward were shot and killed. You're going live for 2.5 hours telling people exactly where you are. If someone wants to do harm, I mean, I don't know. How do you get around that? I just think that for the average person, viewer, watcher of your show, of this situation here, I think that it's important the message be that, this is something that just like this is a workplace shooting for all intents and purposes. This is something that happened within their workplace, but then the ripple effects for people that have worked alongside this person who, are also reporters getting assigned. I mean, I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, if I walked into the newsroom today and they said, you have to go live from someplace, I'd be like, eek. Okay. And my hope is that maybe we let everybody take a beat and we take a week off from going live. I can tell you, I've seen 2 local reporters here in Chicago who posted on Instagram. Both of them have been inside the station from different stations. That could be a coincidence. That could be something that was intentional by management to keep people safe. But I can tell you that the people that I've talked to who are still dear friends of mine that are in the business are very shaken up by this. And, there are people that report for local and network.
Yeah.
Marissa, Aaron, can you guys talk about, because, for me, I was over on the weather. So I could watch the news almost like I was watching it. I was in the same room with you guys, but I was outside of these kinds of things when you guys had to talk about that sort of thing because I was doing the weather. So when something like this happens and you then have to sit on the desk and talk about it, there are also other weird dynamics like, okay, we got to talk about this. I want to hear how you guys feel, but also you're then coming in the next day when you've got to get on the air and discuss it. And you're like, okay, we should wear black. We should so it makes you feel like you're not having those human reactions because you still have to get on and cover it. And you're having wardrobe thoughts and where should we, you know what I mean? That kind of stuff has to make you feel kind of weird, but it's got to be done.
Right. Well, and you bring up a good point because there was another reporter who was in Orlando who then, of course, had to talk about his death, Luana Munoz, and she, basically didn't get through the report. Understandably, she started breaking down because, it's a colleague. And, I don't want this to come off too much as poor journalists. And that's why we this is nothing like being a firefighter or a police officer. This is just us trying to shed some light on how this could happen and hopefully increase awareness that it is increasingly dangerous to be a reporter in the field. And I don't know that I have seen enough changes or thoughtful conversations about how to keep reporters safe in the field. And I think that just by the fact that Marissa and I can't point to any significant training that we had in 2 decades of doing it is rather significant, right?
Yeah. And
Well,
even though you guys were covering that stuff, I wasn't. I was covering weather, but anything could have happened with any crew that's out on any scene covering any story, right?
And what I will say, and I can say this because I'm not hosting your show and I'm not a journalist anymore, but in this country, if we choose to have guns still readily available to people, this is going to be a reality moving forward. And this is, how many workplace shootings have we covered? Hospitals where people walk in and shoot doctors and nurses, office buildings, news reporter. I mean, the list goes on and on. So we have every right to have this conversation about another workplace shooting in our country. And now it's gone to journalists. Again, in 2015, Allison Parker and Adam Ward lost their lives because of guns. And I don't want to make it a political thing, but Aaron, to your point about like, oh, woe is us, it's not about that. It's that the policy in our country has put this at the forefront. This is something that's going to be front and center. And we have every right to shed light on what it's like to do it in our industry. I think that that's very fair. And I think that, to your point, if it's going to be something that is a risk that news professionals have to deal with, then we need some training. There needs to be some sort of awareness. Is it something, and just so, the average viewer has an understanding, your average viewer, there is a very big debate about unmarked news vehicles versus marked news vehicles. And so
this one was unmarked.
Yes.
And this one was unmarked. Right. And so who knows, maybe the guy thought he was shooting 2 random people, didn't realize, not that matters, but it just, you never know. And so there's the big debate about, do you wrap your news van and, hey, we're news, don't, come after us, or
does that make you a target?
Make you more of a target?
Right. Depends on the situation.
It depends on the situation. It also depends on the news management's judgment and the experiences they have been through with marked versus unmarked. I can tell you, covering, to be honest with you, one of the most dangerous things I've ever had to cover is, I shouldn't even say this, any sporting event where there's a championship involved, forget it. We have drinking and excitement and violence and hormones and whatever. And so the amount of news vehicles that get destroyed and things like that because they're marked. And of course, if there's people in them, well, that just adds to it. And so I think there's a lot of conversation around this topic. But Megan, I do want to get back to what you talked about with sitting there. And I think that as news professionals, I think, and Aaron, feel free to jump in here, but I do think that you have to sort of understand the tone of what the day is, whether it's St. Patrick's Day and you're going to wear green and white, or whether it's there's been a very traumatic situation that has happened in your community and we need to reflect that back. I remember when I covered the plane crash in 3407 in Buffalo, I remember I wore black for 2 weeks. I wore a cross around my neck. I wore I dressed like I was going to a funeral because that's. But
do you feel weird though? I get what you're saying. You were being sensitive to the situation, but you're fine. You're alive. You're covering the end of their lives, and you're thinking about what you're going to wear.
But you're not
you
fine.
Have to.
You're not fine. I think that's what it comes down to.
That's what
right?
I'm saying. And then there's that weird guilt of having to still get on and make sure your hair looks good. And, ooh, does this cross look right? But then you're like, oh my God, I'm wearing this because of, you know what I mean? There's just that weird feeling about the whole thing.
There's so much that goes into reporting on tragedies day after day after day. And I think, as professionals, there is a moment where you can kind of check it at the door, right? You can go on, you can still have coherent thoughts. I can ask thoughtful questions. I can relay the facts, but the most difficult time in my professional career was the Cleveland kidnappings, because it was, a couple weeks of learning just atrocity after atrocity and not being able to remove yourself from that. Not only not remove yourself, but read everything that comes, because you have to know everything that's going on. And there were several days where, we were watching a live court feed and then, doing interviews, and I would walk off the set and just cry, So I was able to hold it together, but I was not okay on set. And I was very much not okay offset either.
And I also think too, at least for me, and I don't know if Aaron, is the same for you, but I always felt like, and this is probably my big sister showing at this point, but like I always felt like if I can be a warm hug to people in a really tough time, like I want to be able to do that. And I'm going to tell you some really crappy information, but hopefully I can do it in a way that's easier to hear and maybe showing a little vulnerability on my part. I mean, I had no problem saying to people in really long traumatic coverage, like, listen, if you need to step away because this is too much, do that. Like, do what you have to do. Like, we're not asking you to watch all the time. I don't think my boss is like that very much, but like at the end of the day, I think people related to that because it was more of a human existence than it was just, I'm on TV telling you the news, you know?
Right.
So I got a question. This question is for both of you, but Marissa, you and I can remember distinctly having this conversation with you when we were talking about just the natural anxiety you feel about life, right? Both of us feel about life. All of us feel about life. And I can remember talking about how we both were always looking for like that worst case scenario. Like you're riding a train and you're thinking, who's going to be the person that starts to shoot up the train? Or, you know, your child has a cold and you're like, oh my God, you remember that one story where it actually wasn't a cold? It was some kind of horrible amoeba from the water from over, you know, that kind of thing. Okay. So like these things build up inside of you as you cover them and cover them and cover them. Whether or not you feel like you're removed from it, it leads to anxiety for the person who's constantly hearing about it. So I guess my question to both of you is, now that we have been out for the amount of time we've been out, do you feel less anxiety? Does it start to go away, or do you still feel those tendencies because it's all still built up from those many years?
I feel like I have a very healthy relationship with danger, perceived or otherwise. And Marissa, I think that you and I were talking about this after, you know, the shooter during the 4th of July parade. Was it Hinsdale? Where was it again?
Highland Park.
Highland Park. Before I go to events like that, I do say, all right, Matt, if something happens, let's meet at the tree. I tell the kids too, hey, if you get separated, this is where we go. That could just mean active shooter, but I don't say that to the kids. We're going to meet by this tree. We're going to go over there. So I feel like I always have an exit strategy, and I can confidently say I don't know that I would have that reaction if I hadn't spent decades in the industry.
Yeah. And I also think, again, going back to my previous point about where we are in this country, I think that's something that you as a mother, that's the control that you can put in place to save your babies. And I support it and do the same thing. You know what I mean?
We all do.
In terms of anxiety, Megan, great question. I would love to tell you. It's definitely gotten better.
Okay.
I definitely have PTSD from working in television news, and I definitely have very, very high moments of anxiety and very low moments where I'm like very balanced. This week was not good for anxiety, and I can only blame it on the fact that I am. Yeah, I feel like you guys are gonna laugh at me, but I'm following a double murder court case very closely out of South Carolina right now, and I'm watching the coverage all day, and I feel like I'm like right back in it again. And so I had a moment this week where I just burst into tears. I was like, oh my God, I'm dying and this, and I have this thing, and oh my God. And it's like, okay, it's not like you have heartburn. You don't have like breast cancer. It's fine. Like everything's fine. You know what I mean? It's like,
yes.
Megan, we talked about that at levels, because, you know, when you're dealing with shootings like this, oh my gosh, you're dealing with shootings in general and traumatic activities. Then you add it where it happens in a workplace where you work, it ratchets that anxiety right back up again.
Yeah. And it may not show up. It shows up in weird places and weird times in your life, like hypochondriac stuff and, you know, like all that. I'm so much better now than I was. I haven't thought I'm going to die from something in a couple years. You guys know how bad I was.
Okay. I want to be respectful of Megan's time because I know you have to pop out.
That's
soon.
okay. I don't have to go now, so we can keep going.
Oh,
I was going to text you. I was going to put it in the chat, but then I would have to lean forward weird.
Yeah.
So
no. Okay. So that's good to know.
Yeah.
The other question that I wanted to ask, again, as we try to share insight about how this could happen, how many times did you as a reporter say to yourself, and how many times did you hear it from people on the street or just your family watching a reporter on the news, why is that person live out there? Why can't they just be live in the studio right now?
Hear it
You
all
know,
the
I
time
mean,
about the
one
weather.
thing-
Why are they standing in the hurricane telling us not to stand in the hurricane?
How many times did we hear that? Why do we insist on now? I can understand if there is a visual scene where you can say, look at this house fire, look at XYZ. But if it's something that there's no value add to being out in the field, why are we always sending reporters out in the
Because
field?
we have the equipment.
Yeah.
That's why. It sounds silly, but it's like, we've got a live truck. Let's put somebody live, even though the story doesn't warrant it.
And I think I remember when I was anchoring weekend mornings here in Chicago, and we only had one reporter, and it was like, okay, what are we going to put him on? And then there was like a scene, and it was like, well, where do you want him to go live? And I remember saying to them, well, is there a scene out there? Are there police cars? Is there no? Okay. Do we not have interviews from people? Do we need to knock on doors? It's 3 a.m. No. Okay. Well, then put them in the newsroom. They're warm. They had, and this is me saying this isn't at the time I was anchoring, but I had reported. And when you're in a live truck, and this is exactly what these two people dealt with in Orlando as well, there's no bathrooms near you. There's usually no food near you, depending on where you are. The living situation that you exist in for that short snapshot of time in your day is not great. And so, I think that, Aaron, to your point, I think news managers don't understand it sometimes because they've always been news managers, right? Like they maybe started as like an MMJ and then moved to a producer and then an EP and then a news director. And all of a sudden they haven't been out in the field. They don't remember what it's like for 10 or 15 years. And so I agree with you. I think, especially for whatever it's worth nowadays, where people are creating content in their dining rooms, in their cars. I mean, no one cares about the school board building or the school board meeting in front of the building that you can't see in the background. It just, there's such a lack of, we are holding on to these things that we did in the 80s and 90s, right?
Yeah,
these like old things.
Well, and how many times did you have to go live just with the city behind you? No, don't come back to the studio. Just give me a nice scenic shot. Just a pretty shot. Right?
Yes.
But let's also talk about the management. Okay, because I feel like, and maybe I'm off base on this, but to me, it's the same thing as those people with all kinds of seniority who are going to take the holidays, whether or not they want them, because God dang it, I finally got to the point where I can take the holiday. There's something about even people who are making those decisions where I had to do this, you can do it too. It's like,
how many managers did you have though who actually went out in the field? Most of my news directors were producers, which means they were always in-house.
Or they came from the assignment desk and then they just were doing the same thing. You're totally right. But it's also like, we don't really pivot from what we did. And that's part of why I think the news business is having problems. Cause like, there's a lot of places where things should be changed and altered and made better. And they're clinging on to the past pretty hard.
I will
example.
Yeah. And I will say, I do think that as the generations get more into the news, and I can't tell you how many, I hate to say this, but like Gen Zers work in newsrooms now and are basically just like, I'm not doing that. I don't want to be a booker. I was hired as a producer. I'm going to produce. I don't want to book people. And that's become like, I think more normal than we realize because we were in it so long ago and then had such storied careers and now we're out of it. But I've had a lot of people that have said, yeah, I hired this gal to produce for my show. And, I asked her to book guests and she was like, I don't really want to do that. Can you imagine?
You would never have. Oh, you want me to get coffee? I stapled papers, got coffee. I mean, like, you just did it. Right.
Well, I still, Marissa, want to do a separate episode on the future of journalism with you.
Yes.
But I think people would be very surprised if they learned the average age of a newsroom. Of the people who were sitting at the computers in charge of writing the stories and picking the stories and sending crews out, most of them are in their mid-20s.
My husband tells me he's a former TV news producer, and he tells a story of he went into a newsroom in Buffalo and he was 24 years old producing the 5:30 newscast and turned to the senior photographer who was 62 years old and was like, I need you to go out and shoot this live shot. And the guy was like, okay. It's just like the young people are telling the older people what to do. And sometimes, to your point, Meg or Aaron, it's like those are the news decision makers. Those are the people making the decisions with news. topic for another day.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think
Because I
there's a
do
lot to
think, though,
unpack.
Marissa, this probably goes back to what you're saying, though, that if the decision to send, Dylan out in the field were being made by somebody younger, I think Dylan would have felt more comfortable saying no, thank you. I think
100%.
a younger person would have been more thoughtful about whether or not he needed to be live in the field. But I think that because newsrooms are generally run by an older guard, and because this is the way it's always been done, this is the way we will continue to do it.
But I wonder
think
if he
so.
was even, we'll never know, but I wonder if he was worried about it. Like, that's the kind of thing he probably did all day, every day.
Yeah, no, you're
Probably
right. There was
didn't
no
even think
there was no
twice.
perceived threat.
No.
And I also wonder too, I mean, I can't imagine being the news director there and the assignment editor and the people that had a hand in making the decision.
Ugh.
Even if, I mean, obviously it's not their fault, but just still I can't imagine what that newsroom is
Well,
going
let's
through.
talk
And
about
like,
that though, Marissa. That is one more point that I wanted to hit on
oof.
today. Is how very small this industry is.
Oh,
So we
tiny.
could all probably name somebody who knows him. And I worked with a wonderful reporter in Cleveland who is from Florida, who went down to Orlando and worked at Spectrum 13 with him. So yes, I was texting her yesterday and I said, I am so sorry. And it is kind of surprising, but not anymore, having, been in this industry long enough, how very small it is.
I feel like when I was in journalism school, people would say that to me, like, "Oh my gosh, it's such a small industry."
Yeah,
And
don't
it's
take
like,
anybody off.
yeah, basically. I mean, even if you end up quitting or leaving or working with people, at least do it like say goodbye and exit in a very graceful way, because chances are you'll run into them again. And to your point, it is a very small industry, and people who know people, and it's just as you age and as you excel in your career, those people that you knew at the assignment desk end up being bigwig producers at insert name here,
Yep. Or they're the news director that you work with down the line.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I think as far as final thoughts go, I would just say that we sincerely send our warmest thoughts to Dylan and his coworkers and the photographer and everybody down there. And my heart goes out to reporters who are still in the field. And I wish I had received this advice when I was younger, that it's okay to push back. Especially now, more and more, right? I mean, we shouldn't have to take a boss's marching orders as gospel.
And I also, on that note, Erin, I would say that if there are current reporters and photographers watching this and hearing this, to understand that to go to work and to have to be afraid is not normal. And if you need help,
okay. Yeah.
and not okay,
Yep.
if you need to take a week off, if you need to, do something to sort of, talk to somebody or whatever the case may be, this is something that warrants maybe taking a mental health break, because this is, it hits really close to home, and anyone who has been near or around a workplace shooting can understand that fully. And I think that advice as we move forward is probably good for everyone.
Right. Right. All right. Well, I guess if somebody has any other questions about how things work, we will love to take your questions and happy to answer them. Marissa, thank you so much for, last minute jumping on with us. That was really nice of you. And yes,
to
be continued. I actually do intend to reach out to a man who does media safety training.
Ooh.
I think that would be really
I
fun.
would love to know, because I mean, I was in that business for 15 years, and the only safety training I remember is how to jump out of a live truck and shuffle on your feet.
That's because that was mandatory.
Yeah.
I mean, that was mandated training, right?
That was the only reason I did it. Yeah. But I didn't have anything else,
It
right?
should be mandated. And that's a good point.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Marissa. Thanks everybody for watching.
Bye, guys.
Bye.